It weighed less than 3 ounces. It fit in the palm of a child's hand. And yet, during World War II, this tiny bar of soap carried more weight than almost anything else in an American home. But here's what most people never knew. This wasn't just soap. It was currency. It was dignity. It was survival. It was the one thing that stood between a family and shame. And the rules that governed it, they were stricter than you might imagine. Families fought over it. Neighbors traded for it. Children were taught to fear wasting even a single bubble. Because when soap ran out, and it did run out, there was no backup plan. No extra bar hidden in the cupboard. No store that would bend the rules. Just empty hands and the slow creep of fear. So why did something so small hold so much power? Why did a bar of soap become one of the most tightly controlled items in wartime America? That part comes next. Picture this. It's 1943. A quiet kitchen in Ohio. Evening light slips through lace curtains, casting soft shadows across a porcelain sink. A mother stands there, holding a sliver of soap no thicker than a dime. She turns it slowly in her hands, carefully, almost reverently, not because she wants to, but because she has to. This bar, this tiny, ordinary bar of soap, wasn't just for washing dishes or hands or faces. It was rationed, controlled, counted, tracked by the government with the same vigilance as sugar, gasoline, and meat. And if it ran out before the month ended, there was no backup plan, no extra bar hidden in the cupboard, no neighbor to borrow from, because they were all counting their own slivers too. Every morning, that soap bar sat in its dish like a silent judge. Every use was a decision. Do I wash the breakfast dishes now or save the soap for the children's baths tonight? Do I scrub this stain from my husband's work shirt or let it stay and preserve what little I have left? This soap bar didn't just clean. It carried the weight of survival, of pride, of staying human when the world felt like it was falling apart. It controlled daily routines. It dictated who could bathe and when. It determined whether a child could go to school with clean hands or stay home in shame. And the strangest part, most families never talked about it, not openly. Because admitting you were running low on soap, admitting you were struggling to keep your family clean, felt like admitting you were failing. So the struggle stayed hidden, behind closed doors, in the quiet calculations of mothers standing at sinks, in the silent shame of children who knew their clothes didn't smell quite right anymore. But what most people never knew is what was hidden inside those strict little rules, the real power soap held. And why, even after the war ended, some families could never forget. It began quietly. In February 1942, the War Production Board made an announcement that would change kitchens, bathrooms, and laundry rooms across America. Soap, simple, everyday soap, was now a war material. At first, people didn't believe it. How can they ration soap? Neighbors whispered at grocery stores. What are we supposed to do? Stop washing? But the government had its reasons. And those reasons were written in chemistry. You see, soap wasn't made from just water and fragrance. It was made from fats, oils, tallow, and most importantly, glycerin. Glycerin was the key. That clear, viscous liquid extracted during soap making wasn't just a moisturizer. It was a critical component in the production of nitroglycerin, explosives, ammunition, bombs. Every bar of soap an American family used meant less material for the war effort overseas, less glycerin for artillery shells, less fat for gunpowder stabilizers. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. American families would have to choose between cleanliness at home and firepower abroad, and the government made the choice for them. On February 15, 1942, soap rationing began. The rules were printed in newspapers, announced on the radio, whispered in grocery store lines. 4 bars of soap per person, per year. 4. Not per month, not per season, per year. That meant 1 bar every 3 months, 12 weeks, 90 days. Can you imagine holding a single bar of soap in your hand, knowing it had to last that long? Knowing that if you used it too quickly, if you washed too many dishes, scrubbed too many floors, bathed too many children, there would be nothing left, and no way to get more until your ration stamps reset? Families did the math immediately. A bar of soap weighed roughly 3 to 4 ounces. If you used it carefully, if you rationed every wash, every lather, every rinse, you might stretch it to 90 days. But if you had a large family, if you had young children who needed frequent baths, if you worked in a factory and came home covered in grease and grime, 4 bars wasn't enough. It was never enough. The rumors spread fast. Shortages were coming. Stores were running low. And if you didn't plan carefully, your family might be left with nothing but cold water and rough hands. Mothers began cutting bars into smaller pieces, wrapping them in cloth to slow their dissolution, mixing soap shavings with water to create thin, stretchy lather that could be used sparingly. But here's the part that haunted them. The government didn't just ration soap, it monitored it. Ration stamps had to be surrendered at the store. Clerks tracked purchases. And if you tried to buy more than your allotment, you were turned away. No exceptions, no sympathy, no second chances. And yet, the strictest rules hadn't even begun. Every morning, the soap dish became a place of strategy. Mothers stood at sinks, calculating. How much can I use today? Will this bar last until next month? What if someone gets sick and needs extra washing? The bar sat there, small, pale, sometimes cracked from drying, wrapped in a damp cloth to keep it from dissolving too fast. Some families kept their soap in a tin box between uses, sealing out air and moisture. Others carved large bars into smaller portions, rationing them day by day, hour by hour. Children were taught early. Wet your hands. 1 swipe of soap. Lather quickly. Rinse. Done. No second swipes. No lather that foamed up to your elbows like it did before the war. No long, luxurious baths where you could soak and scrub and feel truly clean. Those days were over. Now, baths were measured. Families bathed in shifts, using the same water to save soap. The cleanest child went first, then the next, then the next. By the time the last child climbed into the tub, the water was gray and lukewarm. But the soap, precious, irreplaceable soap, had been stretched as far as it could go. One woman in Iowa remembered her mother saving soap slivers in a tin can on the windowsill. When enough had collected, her mother would melt them down on the stove, pouring the liquid into a mold to form 1 new bar. Nothing was wasted, she said years later, her voice soft with memory. Not a single bubble, not a single scraping. But here's the part that gets forgotten. Soap controlled more than just hygiene. It controlled social standing. A clean child meant a respectable family. A clean dress meant dignity. A clean home meant you were still holding on, still fighting, still surviving with grace. And if you ran out, if your children showed up to school with dirt under their nails, with greasy hair, with clothes that smelled of yesterday's cooking and last week's sweat, people noticed, they whispered, they judged. Teachers pulled children aside and asked pointed questions. Neighbors exchanged glances. And in a time when everyone was supposed to be doing their part, when patriotism meant sacrifice and endurance, running out of soap felt like a personal failure. So mothers stretched every bar as far as it would go. They boiled laundry with wood ash and lye, scrubbing fabrics by hand until their knuckles bled. They scrubbed floors with sand and vinegar, saving soap only for the most essential tasks. They made choices, quiet, invisible choices that no one outside the home would ever see. Do I wash my husband's work clothes or save the soap for my daughter's school dress? Do I clean the kitchen counters or make sure my son's face is spotless before church? Do I use soap now or risk running out entirely before the ration stamps reset? These weren't dramatic choices. They didn't make headlines, but they shaped every single day. And they left scars, not physical ones, but the kind that live in memory. The kind that make you pause decades later before throwing away a soap sliver the size of a postage stamp. But there was something else too, something darker, something that grew in the shadows while families struggled to stay clean. Because when soap became currency, it also became something people would lie for, cheat for, trade for. And that part comes next. Not everyone played by the rules. In cities across America, a quiet trade began. Soap bars exchanged hands in alleyways, in back rooms of stores, in hushed conversations after church. The black market for soap wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve gangsters or midnight deals. But it was real. A bar of ivory could buy you butter. A bar of Lux could get you stockings. A bar of Palmolive might secure you a pound of sugar or a tin of coffee. And if you knew the right grocer, the right neighbor, the right clerk at the pharmacy, you could get more than your ration allowed, much more, but most families didn't have those connections. They had their 4 bars a year, and that was it. They followed the rules because they believed in fairness, in shared sacrifice, in doing their part for the war effort. Meanwhile, wealthier households found ways around the restrictions. They bought luxury soaps before the ration hit. They hoarded. They stockpiled in attics, in basements, in locked cupboards where no one could see. And when their neighbors ran out, some shared, but others didn't. One woman in Pennsylvania remembered standing in line at the grocer, watching a woman ahead of her pull out 2 months' worth of ration stamps for soap. The clerk didn't bat an eye, didn't question it, just rang up the sale and wrapped the bars in brown paper. "How did she get so many?" the woman whispered to her sister. Her sister shrugged, her face tight with frustration. "Money," she said simply. "Money talks, even now." Because even in wartime, even under rationing, there were always ways to get more. If you had the right resources, if you had the right name, if you had the right skin color, Black and immigrant families often found their ration stamps lost or delayed. Clerks claimed they'd run out of stock when certain customers walked in, only to have plenty available when others arrived. Rural families had to travel miles, sometimes dozens of miles, to redeem their stamps, only to find the stores empty. And women who worked in factories, scrubbing grease and oil from their hands every night, coming home exhausted and filthy, were expected to make the same 4 bars last as the housewife who stayed home all day. The system was supposed to be fair, equal sacrifice for equal citizens, but fairness, it turned out, was just as rationed as the soap. And the inequality didn't just breed resentment, it bred desperation. Families who ran out of soap before their stamps reset had few options. Some made their own, boiling animal fat and wood ash in backyard kettles, creating harsh, gritty bars that burned the skin but were better than nothing. Others went without. They stopped bathing regularly, stopped washing clothes, stopped scrubbing floors, and they lived with the shame of it, the quiet humiliation of knowing they smelled different, looked different, felt different than their neighbors. But there was a moment, a single, quiet moment, in the winter of 1944, when everything almost fell apart. It happened slowly, then all at once. In the winter of 1944, soap stopped arriving. Not officially, not dramatically. There were no announcements, no emergency broadcasts, no government warnings, but shipments slowed to a trickle, stores ran out. And families who had stretched their last bar to the thinnest sliver, who had scraped and saved and rationed with military precision, found themselves staring at empty shelves. The ration stamps were useless if there was no soap to buy. No one panicked, not outwardly. Americans had learned to endure silently, to keep their struggles private, to maintain a facade of normalcy even when everything felt like it was crumbling. But inside homes, a quiet fear spread. What do we do if there's no more soap? How do we stay clean? How do we keep our dignity? One mother in Michigan told this story years later, her voice still trembling with the memory. Her youngest daughter, barely 6 years old, came home from school crying. Another child had called her dirty, said her dress smelled, said her hair looked greasy and unwashed. The mother felt her heart crack. She went to the cupboard, opened the tin where she kept the soap, and found nothing but a fragment no bigger than a button. A sliver so small it would barely lather, so thin it would dissolve in seconds. She stood there, holding it in her palm, feeling its weight, or lack of weight, knowing she had 2 choices: use it now and have nothing left for the rest of the month, or save it and send her daughter back to school unchanged, unwashed, vulnerable to more cruelty. She chose to use it. She filled a basin with warm water, heating it slowly on the stove. She called her daughter over, knelt beside her, and began to wash her hair with the last piece of soap they had. The fragment dissolved almost immediately. But she worked it through her daughter's hair, scrubbing gently, whispering soft reassurances. "You're clean now. You're perfect. Don't you listen to anyone who says different." And when it was done, when the soap was gone and her daughter's hair hung damp and clean, the mother didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just dried her daughter's hair, braided it tight, and sent her off to bed. But inside, she carried the weight of that choice for weeks, because there was no more soap, not until the ration stamps reset, not until the next shipment came in, if it came in. And in the meantime, families did what they'd always done. They improvised, they endured, they made invisible sacrifices that no one would ever write about in history books. Some made soap from bacon grease and lye, creating harsh bars that stripped the skin but were better than nothing. Others boiled clothes in plain water, scrubbing with brushes until their hands bled. And some simply went without, living with the dirt, the smell, the shame. But slowly, the shipments returned, the shelves restocked, and one by one, families breathed again. But something had changed. Something quiet, something that would linger long after the war ended. The soap shortage of 1944 had taught them a lesson, that even the smallest comforts could disappear, that even the most basic needs could be taken away, and that survival, real survival, meant learning to live with less than you ever thought possible. By the spring of 1945, soap rations began to ease, not all at once, not dramatically, but little by little, stores had more stock. Ration stamps stretched further, shipments arrived on time, and families who had counted every bubble, every sliver, every single use for 3 long years finally exhaled. But the habits didn't disappear. Mothers still saved soap slivers in tin cans, still wrapped bars in cloth to preserve them, still taught their children to use only what they needed, no more, no less. Because once you've lived with less, once you've felt the weight of a tiny bar of soap in your hand and known it had to last 3 months, once you've watched your child come home crying because other kids said she smelled, you don't forget. You can't forget. One woman in Tennessee kept her wartime soap tin on a shelf in her kitchen for the rest of her life. Empty, dusty, but she couldn't throw it away. "It reminds me," she said, her fingers tracing the lid, "of what we survived." And when the war finally ended, when soldiers came home, when factories switched back to peacetime production, when soap flooded the stores again in abundance, there was relief, gratitude, joy, but also something else, a quiet knowledge that cleanliness had once been a privilege, that dignity had once required rationing, that something as small as soap had carried a nation through its darkest years. And for those who remembered, who had lived through the shortage and the fear and the shame, they never took it for granted again. The ration books were burned in neighborhood bonfires, the coupons discarded, the rules forgotten, officially. But in kitchens across America, the memory stayed. Older women who had lived through the rationing never wasted soap again. Not a single bar, not a single sliver. They saved every fragment in jars, melting them down when enough had collected. They wrapped new bars in cloth, storing them carefully between uses. They used soap sparingly, even when abundance returned, even when stores overflowed with options. Their daughters watched, their granddaughters learned. And decades later, in homes where no one had ever known wartime scarcity, soap was still treated with care, still saved, still respected. Because some lessons don't fade. They're passed down, whispered, embedded in the way you wash your hands, the way you squeeze the last bit from a bar, the way you pause before throwing anything away. Soap companies noticed the shift too. After the war, advertisements changed. They didn't just sell cleanliness anymore. They sold abundance, luxury, freedom. You don't have to ration anymore, the ads promised, in bright, cheerful fonts. Use as much as you want, lather freely, bathe luxuriously. Magazine pages showed women surrounded by towers of soap bars, smiling with relief and joy. But for those who remembered, that abundance felt strange, almost wasteful, almost wrong. Some of them never quite adjusted. They bought soap, yes, but they still saved the slivers. They still wrapped bars carefully. They still felt a pang of guilt when they used more than they absolutely needed. And some of them, the ones who had gone without, who had watched their children shamed, who had made impossible choices at kitchen sinks, they cried the first time they stood in a store and realized they could buy as much soap as they wanted. No ration stamps, no limits, no rules, just soap, rows and rows of it, and the freedom to choose. Even now, today, if you talk to someone who lived through the war years, who remembers standing at a sink with a sliver of soap in their palm, they'll tell you they still can't throw away a soap bar until it's completely gone, until there's nothing left but a memory of what it once was. It's easy to look back now and think, it was just soap, just a bar of cleanser, just a household item, just something you pick up at the store without a second thought. But that's not what it was. Not during those years. Not to the people who lived through it. That tiny soap bar, no bigger than your palm, no heavier than a few ounces, taught an entire generation what survival looked like. It taught them discipline, the ability to measure, to ration, to make a single resource last far longer than seemed possible. It taught them patience, the willingness to wait, to endure, to accept that abundance might not return for a long time. It taught them creativity, the ingenuity to find solutions when the usual methods failed, melting slivers, making homemade soap, washing in cold water, scrubbing with sand. It taught them sacrifice, the quiet, invisible kind that happens behind closed doors where no one sees and no one applauds. It taught them that dignity didn't come from abundance. It came from making the most of what you had. It came from keeping your family clean, your home respectable, your head held high, even when it felt impossible. And maybe it taught them something even deeper, that community matters, that sharing matters, that the neighbor who slips you a sliver of soap when you've run out, who doesn't judge, who doesn't ask questions. That neighbor is what holds a society together when everything else is falling apart. Because the families who made it through weren't just the ones who rationed well. They were the ones who helped each other, who traded what little they had, who looked out for the widow down the street, the new mother next door, the elderly couple who couldn't make their ration stretch. Soap became more than a commodity. It became a measure of humanity, a test of character, a reminder that even in scarcity, you could still choose kindness. And maybe that's the lesson that matters most. Not that soap was rationed, but that Americans, ordinary, everyday Americans, found a way to carry on anyway. They stretched, they saved, they sacrificed, and they did it quietly, without fanfare, without complaint, without asking for recognition or reward, because that's what survival required. That tiny soap bar didn't just clean hands and dishes and floors. It carried a nation through one of its hardest chapters. It held families together when everything else threatened to tear them apart. It preserved dignity when dignity felt like the last thing anyone had left. And if you listen closely, if you talk to those who remember, you'll hear the same thing again and again. We made it work. We always made it work. We had to. And maybe that's the story worth remembering, not the rationing itself, but the resilience it revealed, the strength it required, the humanity it demanded. So the next time you stand at a sink, the next time you unwrap a fresh bar of soap, feel its weight in your hand, smell its clean, familiar scent. Think about this. Once, not so long ago, that small bar carried the weight of survival. It represented choices no family should have to make. Sacrifice no one should have to endure. Dignity that had to be fought for, preserved, rationed out in careful measures. It was counted. It was tracked. It was stretched to its absolute limit, and yet it endured, just like the people who used it, because that's what Americans did during World War II. They took the smallest things, a sliver of soap no bigger than a coin, a ration stamp worth a single bar, a whispered prayer that it would last just a little bit longer, and they made them last. They made them matter. They made them enough. And in doing so, they proved something powerful. That survival isn't about having everything you need. It's about making the most of what you have. It's about caring for what little remains. It's about holding on to cleanliness, to dignity, to hope, even when everything tells you to let go. So here's to the tiny soap bar, the one that cleaned more than skin, the one that carried a nation through its darkest hours, the one that taught us all that even the smallest things can hold the greatest weight, and that the true measure of a generation isn't found in their victories or their wealth, but in how they survived when they had almost nothing, how they preserved their humanity when it would have been easier to let it go, how they cared for each other when caring required everything they had left. That's the legacy of the soap bar. That's the story it tells. And that's what we must never forget.